And we are rolling on part 2 of our sentencing project, shall we say, on whether we lock up too many people or not. And we are in the midst of a cross-examination of Yacht by your name?
Tiffany.
Tiffany, rock and roll. Tiffany, you have 1 minute.
Okay, so you said violent crime is increasing, but incarceration is decreasing. So can you clarify how that works?
So mechanically, how that works is that violent crime.
Don't look at him. Look at me. I'm
violent
the man.
crime has been increasing over the past couple of years. 2015 and 2016 have reported one of the highest levels of violent crime since 2005, and that, in conjunction with declining incarceration rates because of the strain that it puts on federal funding, etc., has created this problem that really there's more crime being caused and less people being imprisoned for that. So I believe that actually goes against what the actual problem is here. Okay,
and you said some crimes aren't reported. Is that in a specific state, or is that all states?
This was a national study that was done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics that found that most violent crimes, 47% of them, go unreported.
Okay, and do you have stats on...
That's time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yacht, am I saying your name right?
Yes.
You needed to obviously allocate your time better. You spent a whole lot of time at the top end, and if you have time, you want to come during office hours or whatever, I'll show you. You presented a lot of what I would call contradictory evidence in your presentation, which is sort of weird. But the other thing I would say is I like your thing about police legitimacy and the Ferguson effect. I don't know if you saw some of that in your research about police just going, why bother? We're there, the public won't support us and they don't like us anymore. And so, that could be the reason for the higher crime rate, or it could be a result of the release of these prisoners who are committing more crimes that we've let out of jail, these so-called non-violent, victimless crimes that are creating more criminals. Anyway, thank you very much, Yacht.
Thank you.
Okay. Next person. And who's cross-examining? Let's go. Who's your cross-examiner?
I don't have one.
Okay, quickly. And who's after? You're Russell?
Yeah.
Okay. Magian. Okay, you should be sitting up here. Magian, will you cross-ex Magian? Yeah, good. Okay, good. Okay, go. Start.
All right. Resolution. The United States locks up too many prisoners. This proposition will be presented as a policy debate taken from the negative position. What's the problem? Some people believe that the United States incarcerates too many people, and for good reason. However, incarceration is not an inherently bad act. Rather, it is a proven method of reducing crime.
Good.
Tom R. Clear, a distinguished professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University, Newmark, in 2007, states that incarceration reduces the rate of a person's criminality through incapacitation and rehabilitation. Incapacitation occurs when a person's incarceration prevents crimes from occurring that the person would have committed. Rehabilitation occurs when the person is changed by the prison experience so that he no longer commits crimes once released from prison. Also, most prisoners deserve to be incarcerated. According to Peter Wagner, an attorney and the executive director of the Prison Policy Initiative, in 2017 states that over 80% of prisoners in state prisons are incarcerated for property crimes such as fraud, theft, and burglary, violent crimes such as murder, rape, and assault, or public order crimes such as driving under the influence and possession of weapons.
Excellent.
Even many drug offenders deserve to be incarcerated. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, drug overdoses is now the leading cause of death in the United States for people under 50. 91 Americans die every day from opioid overdoses alone. The criminals selling the drugs that are ravaging our country should be incarcerated. The real problem is crime. According to the Brennan Center for Justice in 2017, the national murder rate rose in 2015 and 2016 due primarily to spikes in Baltimore, Chicago, and Washington. How big's the problem? According to a 2017 article by Business Insider, homicides in St. Louis, Baltimore, and Detroit are on track to break records. Why do we have the problem? There are two main causes of the problem: reduced incarceration and socioeconomic circumstances. Firstly, reduced incarceration. According to John J. Donahue, an economist and a professor of law at Stanford Law School, in 2017, the 8.6% drop in the incarceration rate since the peak of 465 prisoners per 100,000 people in 2007 is now providing a stimulus to crime, as more convicts, who typically have high recidivism rates, are returning to the streets than criminals are being taken off.
Good.
One could easily get an upward bump of 1.5% in the homicide rate from prison population decreases of this magnitude. Secondly, socioeconomic circumstances. The American Psychological Association in 2017 states, although exposure to violence affects all socioeconomic status groups, youth from lower groups tend to have increased exposure and likelihood of suffering from detrimental future outcomes. It makes sense that people in lower socioeconomic groups are more willing to commit crimes because of troubled upbringings and a lack of other options. The solution. There are three main components to the solution: increasing incarceration and increasing education for both youth and prisoners. Firstly, incarceration is an effective solution for reducing crime. According to Magnus Lofstrom, a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, and Stephen Raphael, a professor of public policy at the University of California, Berkeley, in 2016, there is fairly strong evidence for the United States and other nations that incarceration can have sizable effects in reducing crime, operating largely through physical incapacitation. Secondly, increasing education of youth reduces crime. In an analysis of the effects of preschool in 2016, Lynn A. Carroll, who earned a doctorate in economics from Yale University, found that Perry preschool reduced the cost of K-12 education, raised lifetime earnings, lowered lifetime welfare use, and reduced lifetimes costs for crime and delinquency. Thirdly, increasing education in prison reduces crime. According to James Gilligan, a clinical professor of psychiatry and an adjunct professor of law at NYU in 2012, getting a college degree while in prison is the only program that has ever been shown to be 100% effective for years or decades at a time in preventing recidivism. Will this solution work? Yes. Incarceration and education are the most proven and effective methods for reducing crime. The advantages: the most obvious advantage is the reduction of crime. Incarceration and education are both proven and effective methods of reducing crime. Increasing incarceration to reduce crime, especially in areas such as St. Louis, Baltimore, and Detroit, far outweighs any negative effects of incarceration. Safety is perhaps the most important aspect of any society, and therefore action should be taken appropriately. A safer, more productive society is possible by increasing incarceration in the United States. I now stand open for cross-examination of points.
Thank you. Okay, crowd into the camera frame. Thank you very much. Very good. Good. Begin.
All right, so your first question, one of your solutions.
State your name, please.
My name is Haley.
Hi, Haley.
Yeah. Okay, so one of your solutions was to increase incarceration rates. So when we have like overcrowding occurring in prisons, where it's like in California, there was the case where it was like unconstitutional. There's so many people in the prison. What's your solution to that?
I'd say prison overcrowding is a little bit of a separate issue. My paper focused on crime and how incarceration is very effective in reducing that. However, in terms of overcrowding, it is possible to build more prisons.
Okay. And then you talked about education. How would getting a college degree help these
Power
prisoners?
stance, Haley. Be powerful presence up there, not weak.
How would the college degree help these prisoners if, when they apply to these jobs, they have to put on their application that they're a felon and they're basically immediately discounted?
It's time to answer the question. It's an interesting one. Thank you. You can sit down, Haley.
So in terms of getting a job afterwards, I didn't look into that, but I have several studies here that show that education, both of youth and prisoners, greatly reduces recidivism.
Real quick, some feedback, Russell. Really excellent brief. I appreciate how you spread your time out and got through your entire brief and still cited all of your evidence, used the Chicago style, and showed you did your arguments from authority and had great authorities and had very recent evidence and had a very convincing evidence that we have a problem when we release these people without, we are going to have a safety problem in our society. So I thought that was really good, especially the crime spikes that you talked about in particular cities. I thought that John Donahoe from Stanford in 2017 was very persuasive evidence, and I like your thing on education and preschool and the college diploma. Really excellent job. Thank you. Okay, next please. Majin, and who's cross-exing? Yes, and then Ryan should be sitting up here. Ryan, who's Ryan?
That's me.
Okay, get up here, Ryan. Who's cross-exing Ryan? That'll be, no, it'll be you.
Okay.
That'll be her. Okay, go. Start. Go.
My name's Meijing Ji.
I'm Majin. Where's your brief? Oh, huh?
Today the topic is like the United States locked up too many prisoners. My favorite section will represent from the negative side. So what's going on? Many argue that the government spends too much on the prison. For example, the California government pays CCA $63 a day for each prisoner, which is more than the basic daily spend of a normal American citizen. In 2009, the state of California's two biggest university system calculated by college student handing into money. Only $7,000 for each college student, but the government spent on holding a prisoner for $50,000.
Hold your paper down a little. You're hiding your face.
Okay.
Thank you.
Even though the comparison shows the U.S. have recently high prisoner rates than other countries, but we need to consider the different social structure within the U.S. The sample in the compatible analysis is not consistent. The United States has one of the highest rates in incarceration in the world. It has 5% of the world's population and nearly 2.5 million prisoners. That means like 25% of the world's prisoners. At the same time, 65 million Americans has a criminal record. Accounting for 20% of the population, it costs taxpayer $68 billion a year. And the U.S. have one of the highest economic inequality in the world, and the guns are permitted. Therefore, the violence and the conflict is invisible. It is commonly believed that the illegal criminal is a violent behavior, but the problem is an economic problem. The gap between rich and poor is very big, and the unequal welfare distribution, poverty, and the inequality, which is the most obvious play. Since the 1970, the inequality has been intensified. The welfare distribution has become more inequality. In 2007, the wealthiest 1% of the household in the United States have the 33.8% of the U.S. wealthy, while the others wealthiest 10% have the other 77.7% of the wealthy, while the 50% of the poor have only 2.5% of the wealthy. The unemployment is high at the bottom of the society. Poor people have no way to guarantee their basic living. At the same time, a tax policy has intensified the inequality. The U.S. on the one hand cut the welfare of the poor, on the other hand lowering the tax of the rich. In economic distributes force the poor to commit crime. The United States is one of the few countries where the citizens have the right to bear arms. Guns crime is easy to happen because you can easily to buy a gun. What is the solution? As the biggest immigrant country where the guns are legal, it is invisible that we have the highest criminal rate than other countries. No one wants to worry about the safety of their life every day, so it is necessary to punish the criminals. I believe it is necessary to maintain a safety and stable society by keeping the criminals that deserve prison time in the prison. On the other hand, we should put more funding into education, which is the fundamental matter to economic inequality I mentioned about. Lowering the welfare of the prisoner and letting them know live that living in the prison is a painful thing. Lower distribution increase the punishment of the malfeasance and promote the capital punishment, rescue the punishment for the malfeasance offense. Using fire or increase community labors. To use the prisoner labor for the economic development. Economic development can promote environment. It can fundamentally rescue the criminal. Will the solution work? As I mentioned about, education is important when it comes to inequality in men. There before, that solution will work by punishment by criminals and encourage better education at the same time. The reason why the prisoner go to prison because they break the law and do the bad thing. They go to jail for punishment rather than welfare.
Thank you very much. Okay, cross-examination, 1 minute. Your name?
Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
So when you said that how expensive incarceration is, but you also recommend increasing the social programs, how do you pay for all of that?
I mentioned later in the debate, but I didn't say it yet. We will use the prison as a labor to build the social structure or economic structure. Just use the prison as a labor.
Okay.
To earn the money.
Wow. They'll make license plates, huh?
And so, why do you consider the incarceration rates too high if it's so expensive?
I didn't think the incarceration rate is too high. It's I didn't think the rate is too high because America have the large population and the guns are permitted, so it's easy to happen the criminal.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Magian, let me give you some feedback real quick. Stand back a little bit. You're out of the picture. Good. Now you're in the picture. Good. I liked your first thing about comparing how much we spend on prisoners, comparing how much we spend on education. So it was good for this audience. That wasn't too bad. You spent too much time on how big the problem is. You talked about why we have the problem, and you talked about the income gap and the fact that we have guns, but you didn't really, in the solution, didn't outlaw guns or do anything about the guns in your solution. So we still have guns, and I personally would need a little more evidence to see that these unskilled prisoners can do much in the workforce, except make license plates, and that was found to be sort of. They used to have chain gangs, where they went out and did real nasty things to them. So this doesn't have a long and good history. But anyway, you needed to practice and space out your time so you got everything in. Thank you. Major. Next person, please. Ryan. Who's cross-acting Ryan? Okay, go up there. Nilo, be up there. Nilo. Who's cross-acting Nilo? Yeah, okay, go, start.
Okay, hello everyone. Again, my name is Ryan. And
Hi, Ryan.
The topic today I'll be discussing is the United States locks up too many prisoners. I'll be discussing this in the affirmative. So, I'd like to start with a quote. Budgets reflect our values. That was said by Education Secretary John B. King Jr. in an article in the Washington Post in 2015. And if you look at our budget, according to a study by the University of California, we spend about 3.7% of the general fund revenue on prisons themselves, while the University of California gets half of that. So just to start out, that is ridiculous. If you go into what the problem is in the United States, as we've heard before, we lock up 2.2 million people, which is nearly 1% of our population here. We lock up more individuals, both population and percentage-wise, than any country in the world, and that's according to the U.S. Department of Education. Following the war on drugs in 1980, that's when we began to start locking people up for petty crimes and for anything under the sun. State and local spending on prisons and jails has tripled in the rate of funding versus public education in the past 30 years, and that again is according to the Department of Education. Again, the issue is so severe that the United States has 5% of the world's population, yet possesses 25% of the world's prisoners. And we spend a whopping $80 billion per year just on incarcerating our own citizens. And that's according to CBS News in an article in 2014. Why is this a problem? Well, one of the first issues that we see today is perpetuated by private prison systems. They have quotas to fill. They have individuals that they need to lock up simply so they can make money. They're contracted facilities, they operate at high costs, and they provide low-quality institutions for those that are locked up.
Is there any evidence for this you're citing?
In the Atlantic article in 2016, yes. If you go to the next page.
Oh, okay.
So the quotas enacted by such prisons, they basically ensure their profitability. On top of that, these are backed by lobbying efforts with politicians who work for these companies, and they say, okay, well, we need to lock up more individuals. How can we get more into the prisons? How can we arrest more people? And ultimately, how do we round up that incarceration rate? Why do we have the problem? So politicians who want to be tough on crime, they perpetuate the issue further by mandating minimum sentencing requirements. And anyone who essentially goes against that is seen as weak. And that is according to an NBC article in 2014. Any politician that dares to attempt prison reform in any sense may end up without office in their next term or publicly disgraced. Imagine if your child had been affected by a crime where the individual was let out and committed a crime again, recidivized, due to one politician's initiatives. And again, the private prisons, which operate on a for-profit basis, their quotas perpetuate this issue. So what is the solution? There are a lot of things that we can do to mitigate this. And the first is to release the nonviolent offenders and those convicted on minor drug charges, those that we say, quote-unquote, victimless crimes. Again, to rescind and lessen the minimum sentencing requirements for many of those crimes. There was a study done in 2014 by Families Against Mandatory Minimums which stated focusing money and resources toward rehabilitation rather than incarceration will definitively help lower recidivism rates. On top of that, if we can apply the state system of parole to the federal system, because right now there is no way to parole out of a federal prison term. If you're in there for life, you're in there for life. There's no way out. That, at the same time, will lessen the burden on our penal system as a whole. Again, that's according to the Public Policy Institute of California in a study from 2015. And another would be to repeal the 3 strikes law. And that essentially ensures life imprisonment for people that have been convicted 3 times of certain types of crimes. Doing all of that ultimately will lower the burden that we have on our prisons. And the question is, will the solution work? It certainly will work with respect to overcrowding. Prisons will become significantly freed up, and an average cost of $50,000 per year will be saved for every one inmate that is released or rehabilitated in the society. Some of the advantages, again, according to the Families Against Mandatory Minimums, an extreme drop in public funds spent on incarceration will allow for this money to be put towards social welfare programs, education, and other initiatives to ultimately rehabilitate. Disadvantage of that would be a potential rise in the crime rate. According to a Time article in 2016, many studies show that there are numbers as high as 64% of individuals being rearrested after 3 years of release. So that's ultimately one of the biggest problems that we can run into when implementing such initiatives. But ultimately, our prisons are overcrowded. There are so many things that we can do to mitigate these issues, and ultimately, we spend way too much locking these individuals up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I now stand open for cross-examination, quickly. Okay, thank you, Ryan. Nilu, who's cross-exing you? Okay, good. And Jared, are you ready to go up? Start, please.
Hi, my name is Emily.
What's your name?
Emily Chen.
Hi, Emily. Oh, yeah, Emily. Yeah.
Okay, since you mentioned that we spend too much on prisons, if we divert this money away, then how do you propose we deal with the increasing crime rates and increased rate of arrest?
Well, the increased rate of arrest would be mitigated by the additional changes I had suggested with respect to repealing the 3 strikes law, lessening minimum sentencing requirements, but spending that money specifically would go towards social welfare programs, rehabilitation programs, community education, initiatives like that would ultimately deter crime in the first place.
Okay. And besides repealing legislation already in place, like you mentioned, like the 3 strikes law, what else do you suggest can be done or implemented, like programs that we can be spending the money on instead of funding these prisons, instead to reduce the rate of recidivism?
Well, to reduce the rate of recidivism, specifically using that money that we save by releasing these prisoners.
That's time. Thank you, Emily. Very nice. Ryan, let me give you some feedback, and I want to give this for everyone, not just Ryan, but if you need to very carefully read the instructions that were given for writing the brief. I asked that this be done in the Chicago style of footnoting, which means the footnotes are at the bottom of each page and numbered, and you fully cite the sources before you begin, including the dates, and you really didn't do that. So we didn't have any way to really assess the credibility of a lot of your evidence. Families against the three-strike law, seemed kind of tenuous piece of evidence, really. I think you got through your case fairly well. I just had some trouble with just some of your evidence, and don't read the disadvantages to your proposal when you're an advocate for your proposal. Let the other side do the disadvantages. Other than that, nice job. Thank you. Okay. Okay. This is Nilo, and is Jared up here? Okay, good. And who's gonna cross-ex Nilo? You? Yeah, okay, go. Sorry, come closer, Front of the brown box. Very good, yes. Okay, rock and roll. Start.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. The topic that we're going to be discussing today is that the United States locks up too many prisoners. This proposition will be presented in the affirmative to the idea that the United States locks up too many prisoners. What is the problem? Well, the United States has the highest prison population in the world. In 2015, there were more than 2.3 million people in prison. In a 2015 speech, Hillary Clinton stated that the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, yet we have almost 25% of the world's prison population. Another problem is that the United States incarcerates individuals who have even committed non-violent crimes, which contributes to the drastic incarceration rate. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons 2017 statistics on inmates currently residing in prison, drug offenses make up roughly 46%. How big is this problem? Well, keeping prisoners incarcerated results in the United States spending billions of dollars each year. In 2016, the United States Department of Education reported that it costs more than $80 billion annually for the United States to keep correctional facilities operating. Also, the United States has continually locked up more prisons than they had space, which inevitably led to overcrowding. According to the United States Bureau of Justice, Department of Justice, in 2015, the following facilities had overcapacity for number of beds by 145% for Illinois, 125% for Nebraska, 123% for Massachusetts. Why do we have this problem? With the inconsistent change over 35 years between policies and government officials backing them. In 1982, Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs, in which he implemented legislation to crack down on the United States increasing drug use. According to Pew Research, in 2017, during his 8-year term, there had been a 78% increase in sentenced federal inmates. In 2013, Attorney General Holder of the Obama administration started a Smart on Crime initiative that allowed for federal prosecutors to no longer have to charge low-level or nonviolent crimes with minimum sentencing. In the same Pew Research, there was a drop of 5% of incarceration during the Obama administration. In 2017, Attorney General Sessions of the Trump administration issued a reversal of the previous Attorney General Holder's Smart on Crime initiative, reinstating that prosecutors are to pursue the toughest sentences even for lower-level drug use crimes. With outdated policies like the mandatory minimum sentencing and three-strike laws, the incarceration sentence increased, leaving prisoners locked up for too long. Mandatory minimum sentencing, which is the minimum period of time a criminal needs to serve without parole, suspension, or probation. Three-strike law. The three-strike law makes it impossible for people to get a second chance at life when being imposed 25 years to life imprisonment. What is the solution? We should repeal and replace the mandatory minimum sentence laws and three-strike law. Former President Barack Obama mentions that in a 2015 speech for nonviolent drug crimes, we need to lower long mandatory minimum sentences or get rid of them entirely. Another solution would be to replace incarceration for nonviolent offenders with probation or a form of drug treatment for drug-inflicted crimes. Former President Barack Obama again states that we should invest in alternatives to prison, like drug courts and treatments and probation programs, which will ultimately save taxpayers thousands of dollars. Will the solution work? Well, it already has. With former Attorney General Holder's Smart on Crime initiative, it prevented prosecutors from aiming for their mandatory minimum sentencing tactics, which resulted in a 5% drop. What are the advantages to my proposal? By repealing the mandatory minimum laws and three-strike law, it would allow for inmates to be charged with reasonable sentences. A probation for non-violent criminals would allow for them to constantly get checked on while giving them an opportunity to rehabilitate and learn from their mistakes. On balances, which outweighs? Ultimately, the United States locks up too many prisoners. With a repeal of a minimum sentence and three-strike laws, it will inevitably leave the court system with the opportunity to not prosecute as many nonviolent crimes with the highest punishment, but rather a punishment that is more suitable. I now stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
Excellent, thank you. Cross-ex, please, quickly. Okay, name?
Hi, I'm Yaksh.
Hi, Yuck. Hi, Yuck. Rock and roll, Yuck. She's not in the frame. Stand close like you like her.
Awesome. So
Over that way more now. Yeah. Good.
Okay, awesome. So the first point of clarification I really wanted to know was that you mentioned the three states. You basically mentioned that we were locking up more prisoners than we can actually house, and you mentioned Illinois and a couple of other states. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this and explain what the national statistics look like, and are these states handpicked?
Well, it's according to the United States Department of Justice, so it's only looking at the United States. And you misunderstood what I said. It was an overcapacity for number of beds, which meant that 145%, which is 45% over 100% of inmates, didn't have beds. So.
Gotcha. And you also mentioned that three-strike laws and mandatory minimums are outdated, but what other viable alternative solutions do you have to those apart from just repealing them?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, parole for nonviolent criminals is one, and former President Barack Obama stated that we should do this, and I would say he's a perfect.
It's time. Is that time? Thank you. Stand up for your feedback. Yaksh, her, just for your own information, her quote went on to give all the states and gave a laundry list. She just read a few of the examples, and she had all the states in her evidence. And they gave for a national aggregate. She had all the states. Okay, on the, she didn't read them in the round, though, you were right. She didn't read them to the group. Yeah. Okay, really nice job. Nilo, is that what you go by? Is that what I can call? Nilu, don't call me Nilo. It's Nilu. Okay, Nilu. Really excellent job, except for quoting Hillary Clinton. Just kidding. You know, she lost, so you know. So you know.
It was rigged.
It was rigged. It was rigged. That's right. Yeah, the Kremlin elected her. Yeah, okay. Elected Trump. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I want you all to notice how Nilu emphasized key parts of her evidence with her voice, like $80 billion a year, which I really liked. And I like the way you talked about how Holder had a good policy, and Sessions has gone back to a bad policy, so we're back on the dark side of the forest, according to you. Your policy was very clear. We're getting rid of 3 strikes and mandatory minimum. I would have been more impressed if you had someone besides President Obama to quote that this would work and this would be a good idea. This is a good solution. You know, we did have Holder's thing as an example, but you know, maybe some scholars, you know, and something like that would have been good. And 30 seconds. Yeah, and I like your 31,000 statistic at the end, so that was good. Thank you. Very nice.
It's double-sided.
Double-sided?
Sorry.
Okay, and who's cross-Xing you?
I do not.
I'll do it.
Cross-X? Okay, good. Oh my God. Okay, good. Quickly, go over there. Okay, start.
All right.
Oh my God,
So,
you're tall.
Ready?
Yeah.
Alright, this proposition will be presented as a policy debate case taken from the negative stance. So to begin with the problem, what is the problem? The affirmative has argued time and time again that the amount of predators that we currently have in the country is largely unnecessary. They have cited the ACLU, which published in 2015 that though we have 5% of the world's population, we house more than 20% of the world's prison population. Though the affirmative argues that one of the main reasons for this over-incarceration is the indictment of a whole bunch of petty offenses, particularly drug offenses, this is actually extremely false. So according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics,
Stand in the power stance. Feet wide in your
in
shoulders.
October 2015, less than 1%, 0.03 to be specific, of the prison population in prison was in for a possession drug offense. So it's not like people walking down the street holding a blunt, smoking it, and they got arrested and were put away for 5 years. That just doesn't happen. Furthermore, the fact is that violent crime is currently on the rise. So according to the Major Cities Chiefs Association mid-year report from 2015 to 2016, aggregated assault nationally rose by 3.4%, with homicide rising by 15% and non-fatal shootings rising by 4%. If you go into some of the nation's largest cities, the numbers are extreme. So for example, on average, most of the largest cities experience an increase in crime overall between 10 and 22%. Furthermore, how big is the problem? It's seen as a big problem because we are dealing with a huge amount of people. Obviously, as was cited by the ACLU, we're dealing with 5% of the world's population, and we're being blamed for imprisoning too many. However, it's important to take into account that even some of the cases, particularly the drug ones that were mentioned by the affirmative, can be problematic. Drug offenses are actually very, very dangerous to our country. So for example, looking at the statistics that were provided by the Center of Disease Control, we found that, number one, there was an increase in the amount of super serious drugs that were being used. So for example, meth and heroin were actually increased. And then when you look at the rates in which diseases such as AIDS and HIV are increased, according to the CDC, 6% of HIV diagnoses in the U.S. were attributed to injection drug use, and furthermore, between 59,000 and 65,000 people die from drug overdoses in this country. So we're dealing with lives at risk here. Furthermore, why do we have this problem? So when we look at the communities that are typically represented in the prison system, a lot of them are black and Hispanic, so people of color. According to a study conducted by the Stanford Graduate School of Education in 2015, it was found that black and Hispanic households are more likely to be in poor neighborhoods, which tend to have weaker schools, more crime and social problems than white and Asian families with the same amount of money. So segregation is stifling the upward mobility of black and Hispanic families in particular. So in state prisons, black people, if you look at the prison population in state prisons, black people are incarcerated at 5.1 times the rate of white people, and Latinos are incarcerated at 1.4% times as the rate of white people. So that information was provided by Caroline Simon in an article in Business Insider in 2016. So because of this systematic deprivation of resources that are set forth by segregation and other oppressive precedents that have taken place in this country, such communities are likely to resort to a life of crime. Furthermore, widening this issue from the scope of particular communities, poverty as a whole is access to resources is an issue as to why we have more crime. So many inmates and prisoners enter the system with a history of mental illness, but the stress of being incarcerated can contribute to the prevalence in prisons. So the lack of programs, particularly rehabilitative programs that exist in prisons, is largely problematic. So furthermore, what is the solution? In order to reduce crime and therefore reduce our need for imprisonment, we must invest into these crime-ridden communities. So this can be done through education. For example, according to the RAND Corporation, it was found that inmates who participated in correctional educational programs had 43% lower odds of returning. Kind of moving on along, will this solution work? Yes, it will work because as it has been shown, what better resource communities have less crime. And by way, we will have less representation in the prisons. Furthermore, in terms of cost, it makes sense financially. So it was found that educational programs cost $1,400 to $1,700 per inmate annually, and that could save prisons between $8,700 and $9,700 yearly per inmate, because those inmates that now have an education that can go out into the real world and create a job life for themselves no longer have to deal with the stress of not having an education and getting a job. So ultimately, I believe that my argument has presented out. My argument presents.
Thank you very much. Let's have a cross-examination. Your name?
Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
Ready?
Go.
Okay, so you said
Oh my God.
3 or 30% of people in prison are in for drug offenses, correct?
Look at me,
I'm sorry,
Daniel.
it was 0.03% of people who are in for drug offenses are in because of possession.
Okay. And then you also said violent crime is on the rise, correct?
Yes.
So wouldn't you argue that the proportion of people in prison for non-violent crimes is justified? Sorry, excuse me.
I would not, because in that situation I was referencing particularly the affirmatives argument that drug offenses is the reason for the large amount of representation in our prison systems, whereas that's not. It's actually because we have violent crime. So in that situation I was only addressing the myth that drugs are the reason for high representation in prisons.
Wouldn't you argue possession is only one cause of one point of drug crimes? There are other drug charges such as like dealing or times.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Let me give you some feedback while the next person is, who is it? Armand is going to stand on deck. Who will cross-ex Armand? You?
I just got sex.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. All right. Daniel did the cross-ex. Yeah. Jarrett, yeah. Well, don't print on both sides, but yeah. I like your evidence on the diffusing this myth that people smoking joints fill our prisons. It's not true. But Daniel asked a pretty good question, you know, and you kind of danced around a little bit about it, but you know, it's kind of tough, especially on this new rise in crime. And is there any reason to have some people incarcerated and that sort of thing? What I want to really get at in my, how much time do I have? A minute? 50 seconds. You said, why do we have the crime? And really what you talked about was just, you know, the socioeconomic gap, you know, just the horrible gaps in the communities and so forth, in the neighborhoods. And they're born in poverty, they stay in poverty, and the mentally ill. I'm going, right on, fella, but then I'm waiting to hear your solution. And your solution is the RAND study that says education gets me 43% solvency. Ain't buying it. I mean, I buy the RAND study, but it's not getting it all the inherency you talked about. And so, you're right. We need an overhaul. We need to reinvest in our inner cities, and we need to reinvest in our educational system if we're going to ever really make meaningful strides. My time is up. Thank you so much, sir. Okay. Go. I need to have Bianca. Bianca up here, please. And someone to cross-X her. That would be you. Yeah. Go. Roll. Rock and roll. Oh, very nice contrast.
States,
blue on white. Very nice.
The United States locks up too many prisoners. This proposition is to be presented as a policy case in the affirmative. I won't spend too much time on definitions, but one that's significant is too many. I define it as the level of which the costs of incarcerating an individual exceeds the costs of rehabilitation, recovery, or education. Now, what is the problem? The U.S. is suffering from a high incarceration rate that only increases the burden of jails and prisons. Most importantly, a vast majority of inmates who are released from prisons and jails are struggling to find jobs and housing. They have been institutionalized for such a long time that society has a hard time accepting them into a new community. I always like to make the joke that we should change our flag poem to "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, behind bars, divisible, with liberty and justice for none." Now, Todd Minton in May of 2015 reported that the number of people confined in county and city jails increased by 1.2% between 2014 and 2015. This is an increase from 750,000 to 760,000. Therefore, in the long run, once these people are released, it will inevitably increase the burden of society. Now, too, according to the United States Department of Justice, rated capacity in jails reached 886,947 beds in 2015, an increase of almost 1% in mid-year 2014. This increase between 14 and 15 was about a third of the average annual increase each year between the year 2000 and 2014. Moving on, over-incarceration will increase the financial burden of the U.S. government. According to The Economist in June of 2015, many of these people are no longer dangerous, but locking up the elderly and treating their ailments costs taxpayers a fortune, typically almost $70,000 per inmate each year. The longer prisoners are inside, the harder it is for them to reintegrate into society. How big is the problem? Federal and state policies have driven up the incarceration rate over the past 30 years. We, the so-called land of the free, have 5% of the world's population, but we hold 25% of its prisoners. In a town hall report in June of 2015 that America locks up too many people for too many things. The number of federal laws has risen from 3,000 in the early 1980s to over 5,000 by 2013. Why do we have that problem? The laws such as mandatory minimum and 3 strikes law make it so a majority of prisoners have to stay in the house for their entire sentence. However, throwing people behind bars is not an efficient way to reduce crimes. In November of 2016, The Economist mentioned that a hefty 83% of such sentences were mandatory. That is, a state or federal law barred the judge from exercising any discretion or common sense. Some are triggered by 3 strikes laws, which demand a severe penalty for a third crime, no matter how minor. If the defendant was previously convicted of 2 others, sometimes those previous convictions can be from the distant past, which is quite unfortunate. Moving on, many laws are unconstitutionally vague according to the Supreme Court. Some of them are too vaguely written that it is so difficult for people to tell whether they have broken these laws, according to Richard Wolff in June of 2015. Now, with over 4,850 federal statutory crimes and an estimated tens of thousands more in federal regulations, neither criminal law professors nor lawyers who specialize in criminal law can memorize all of the conduct that is criminalized. Ordinary individuals are at an even greater disadvantage. What is the solution? What is the solution? Currently, these ex-inmates are forced into the circle of unstable job opportunities, which could be a contributing factor to making them violent again, which would in turn increase the incarceration rate. My solution is to keep renewing and amending the Second Chance Act, which will help ex-inmates to get out of the state of poverty because of their criminal profile. Moreover, the Second Chance Act can be revised so that prisoners who are less dangerous or have committed relatively nonviolent crimes will be under restraint outside of prisons. The government does not need to spend a large amount of budget on imprisonment, but on criminal education so that they can get out early and contribute to society. 2. American prisoners should not be locked up for minor petty crimes they committed. We can see a change by amending existing laws or standards such as mandatory minimum and 3 strikes laws. Several states have already started to retreat from ultra-tough sentencing. 3. Certain drugs that are less harmful can be legalized under a very strict control by the government because there are an abundance of prisoners who are drug dealers. According to research conducted in 2015 by King, Peterson, and Elderbroom, cutting lengths of stay 50% for drug trafficking offenses would reduce the federal prison population 18% by 2023. In conclusion...
That's time. Thank you. Next time I'm for cross-examination. Quickly, go up there. start.
All right, you mentioned that
Move over to that way a little bit, please.
you
Both
mentioned
of
that
you.
incarceration
Both
is
of
not
you move over that way. Thank you.
You mentioned that incarceration is not effective, and you cited mandatory minimum laws and then the vague and many laws. Wouldn't that just mean that the policies that are putting people in prison are not effective and not necessarily
Right, that is
incarceration?
exactly what I'm saying. They're not effective because a lot of these people who are committing these minor petty crimes are not being are being placed in prison for no reason. And New York has actually put an incentive for judges to put the more dangerous into prison.
Look at me. Your name, sir?
Russell.
Russell?
Since they have so much prison overcrowding.
Okay, you also mentioned a few times that incarceration rates are increasing, and I know one of the times you mentioned it, you referred to in county jails. Do you know about the incarceration rates nationally?
No.
Okay. Russell makes a good, have a seat, Russell. Russell makes a good point. You need to choose national statistics, and some of your statistics for county jails were not compelling and not persuasive. My biggest problem, how much time do I have? 2 minutes? My biggest problem was on why, not on how big we have the problem, that was all good, but why we have the problem. In particular, mandatory minimum, and you eliminating that, you got at that with your solution, but the constitutionally vague laws and the proliferation of all these laws and regulations, you didn't breathe on in your solution. And so we still have that, and so you need to always check to be sure every reason you isolate for why we have the problem, you deal with in your solution. Okay, and then that's real important. Better time allocation, and don't get so hung up on the high top part of your case. Get to your advantages. They're what sell. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Come back to follow.
Come back to follow. Bianca. Is Jared in the house? Who's doing Bianca? You are? Okay. And where's Jared? Okay, get up there, Jared. Who's going to cross-ex Jared? You will? Okay, good. Rocket start. Okay.
Am I in the right place?
You're perfect.
I'm wearing white.
Yeah, nice contrast. Thank you for wearing black. You're a nice contrast to the white background. Thank you so much. Very nice. Yeah.
Whose time is it you? Yeah.
Rock and roll, Bianca. Yeah, go.
So this proposition is presented as a policy debate taken from the negative stance in that the U.S. does incarcerate the right amount of people. I'm going to skip all the definitions, but I would like to draw your attention to the term so many. It's upon this term that the burden of resolution rests, and in this brief the phrase will be weighed by a cost-benefit analysis of incarceration in which advantages outweigh disadvantages. Criterion for this concept is whether the amount of people imprisoned is justified by the threat to public safety posed by their release. So what is the problem? It's a common misconception that the current incarcerations in the U.S. are too high. However, significantly lowering these rates purely for the sake of it will not solve the problem. It actually creates a bigger issue by putting more violent criminals on the streets. The vast majority of people who are in prison are there because they committed a violent crime, according to a 2015 article from the Journal of Issues in Science and Technology.
Good.
In 2016, the Marshall Project stated that if 100% of all people convicted of drug, public order, and property crimes were released early, you would still need to free, say, 40% of robbery offenders in order to achieve a 50% reduction in the prison population.
Good.
This throws a veil over the real problem, which is that the high rates of recidivism once these violent offenders are released from prison actually pose a bigger threat. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission in 2017, nearly half of the federal offenders studied by the Recidivism Research Project were rearrested within 8 years. How big's the problem? Releasing inmates to arbitrarily lower the incarceration rate is a big problem because it results in decreased public safety. In 2015, Bill Bratton, who's the commissioner of the NYPD, said that one of the issues of concern is when people go to jail, oftentimes they go to jail with negotiated charges. So that somebody that seems they're a non-violent drug offender may in fact have crimes on record in their violence. So not only does Russia's efforts to lower the incarceration rate allow more violent criminals to roam the streets, but it results in these prisoners committing more crime after their time in jail. In a study by the National Institute of Justice, researchers found that within 5 years of release, 76.6% of released prisoners were rearrested. and 70% of these were violent offenders.
Wow.
Why do we have the problem? Because both crime and incarceration rates have been decreasing in recent years, according to Pew. The real problem is actually the threat to public safety posed by increasing recidivism, which is in part due to hasty and ill-equipped attempts to lower these rates. Bill Bratton, who again is the NYPD commissioner, has raised concerns about the federal prison release before, saying that these rushed efforts will leave ex-cons without the services they need to avoid returning to crime and without adequate supervision. So what's the solution? The real solution isn't arbitrarily lowering the numbers for incarceration rates but instead by mandating a different approach to reforming the prison system, which is from the inside out. According to the Brookings Institute, crime could actually be reduced if the savings were put to use strengthening other criminal justice programs and implementing other reforms. Families Against Mandatory Minimums, or FAM, recently released a report on how to restore actual toughness into our criminal justice system by suggesting what useful treatment and skills should look like, how to incentivize programming for prisoners who may not take advantage of existing opportunities, and how to structure post-incarceration supervision so that skills training turns into actual employment.
Yeah.
Yes, the solution will work. Prison does work. That's why we have prisons, and that's why it's been part of our society for hundreds of thousands of years. But focusing our efforts on investing in and increasing and improving useful treatment and skills for prisoners who are already within the system will make prisoners stay more effective and reduce the chances of them committing more crimes after their release. What are the advantages? First and foremost, as I said, prison works to increase public safety. However, implementing strategies to target recidivism works even better. By reducing the amount of people who commit crimes after they are released from prison, we increase safety. The Brookings Institute in 2016 calls reducing recidivism a public safety imperative. Skipping the disadvantages. On balance, reducing incarceration rates for the sake of reducing incarceration is not only obsolete, but the benefit of lowering the rate of incarceration, is not outweighed by its cost, which is allowing the most violent of criminals to roam free. The prison system does need to be reformed, but this change has to come from the inside out, not the outside in. To further increase safety, we should invest instead in options that will reduce the likelihood of convicted criminals committing even more crimes following their time in prison, because as a society, our highest value is public safety, and that's what we should be judging this debate off. I now stand open for cross-examination.
Excellent. Thank you, Bianca. Okay, quickly. I need to see a body up in front of me. Thank you. Good. Rock and roll.
So do you think like America should like correct the justice system to like lowering the imprisonment?
Look at me. I'm the king.
Sorry, I didn't.
So do it again.
Do you think Americans should corrupt the justice
Over here.
system?
No, I don't think they should corrupt the justice system. I've never said that.
But you mentioned like there like we should do some way after like the prisoner go out when they go out the prison they should do better so in case they will return. It's also like the way to lowering like the
So I'm arguing against recidivism, but that shouldn't come through corruption. It should come through reformation.
Keep going.
Okay, so you don't think like there's like
Don't look at her. Look at the audience.
So you don't think there's like law like justice issue exists in America today?
No.
Time. In a word, no. Thank you. Okay, have a seat there, Major. Okay, Bianca, let's give you some feedback. Really excellent brief, really well timed and planned out. I liked your so many. I liked your way you read your brief. I liked the newness of your evidence. I liked the science and the Journal of Issues in Science and Technology. And I like that projection of even if you release all these people, you still would have to release many more to get any kind of efficacy. That was really excellent. I like your stress on public safety. That was really excellent. Your statistic on 5 years, 76.6% were rearrested and 71.3% were violent offenders. Ouch.
Yes.
Good evidence, my word.
Thank you.
Now, on your blame, Bratton, who was here in L.A. for a while, as you know.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, he did a good job here, I thought, actually. Any case, you were a little, how much time do I have?
45 seconds.
Okay, well, I thought why we have the problem was a little light, but I did like your approach of the inside out, and that was good. I'm not a big fan of this families, but they do offer an important voice that has to be heard, but that has to be buttressed also with other scholarly and other things like the RAND Corporation and other people backing up model studies of what they say and what they can do. And your unbalanced thing and your public value, I mean, your highest value, public safety, of reminding us of your highest value was well argued and persuasive. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bianca. And next, quickly. Oh, time.